Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to look at an interesting book. This is a memoir called A Girl and Five Brave Horses. Now, I came across this book because as a child, I loved a film by, unfortunately, Disney, because you can't escape Disney. But the film was called Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken. It told the story of this young girl who joined a traveling act where she eventually tamed a horse by the name of Lightning and used it in essentially the act where she would climb to the top of this 40-foot tower. This horse would be released. It would run up. She would jump on its back and it would jump into a pool of water. And it kind of, the film goes, I will review the film. It goes throughout her kind of career there and ends with her going blind and then continuing to ride. So, The Girl and Five Brave Horses is a memoir of the actual person. Her name was Sonora Carver. And the film gets like three things right in the entire thing. She rode horses, she went blind, well, four things. She continued to ride, and she married the original owner's son. That's it. The film, why very, very good, very, very fun, got about, those were it. That was all that all it got right. So in the real life thing, Sonora was a young girl. Her mother was flighty, quite flighty. She had a bunch of younger siblings from various different men. Mom went from place to place. When they were in New Orleans, the diving show came and they put out an ad looking for a diver. And her mother convinced her to go to talk to them. She originally said no. She eventually changed her mind, wrote to them, and they'd already kind of left town. But the owner, what was his name? He was called Doc Carver, is what they called him. And he had been with the Wild West shows. He'd done a bunch of stuff before he started doing this with his two children. Something else they cut out completely in the film. They cut out his daughter. So he comes, they're in their winter basically resting grounds, which was Florida. He comes up, picks her up, and she goes with him and trains. And essentially with his son and his daughter. His daughter is a diver. His son kind of runs that show. So they do two separate shows. And then it chronicles her time with the father and two of the horses, because they split them. I think they had three horses with them and the two horses with the son and daughter. And she has a strange relationship with him. No, it's not a love story with those two. She doesn't eventually marry the son. But he was very old-fashioned, so she had cut her hair short, which was the style of the time. This is the 1920s. She lets it grow out. She dressed conservatively just to kind of make him happy. And she almost becomes, as he gets older, his caretaker. And it goes through how she's diving with these horses. She talks about the different horses and how things progress. And eventually they end up in Los Angeles. Now in the film, and I'll probably talk about this more, they use the horse Lightning. There was a horse by the name of Lightning. It was female. Unfortunately, in Los Angeles, they wanted them to dive into the ocean, and Lightning drowned when they were doing this. They got one of the other horses out. And after that, it's like, yeah, no, we're not. We're no more diving into the ocean. We're diving into a pit of water. It's a heck of a lot safer. So, eventually what happens is Doc dies. He's an old man. I think he ends up with a stroke. He has heart issues. And he ends up dying. And Sonora goes with the son. The daughter, they hire another diver. I think at first it might be her Sonora's sister, who was 15 at the time, but that doesn't entirely work out. They hire somebody else by the name of Marie, I believe. It's been a little bit since I read the book. It was a very, very good book. And they still had the separate shows. She and the son, who also starts going by Doc. I believe I can remember his name. Yeah. So yeah, after the death of Doc, she marries the son, Al. So they get married. They're still diving the horses. They eventually station themselves in Atlantic City. So that's where they're going to go. They're there for a couple of years. They become friends with these tightrope walkers. And then what happens is with a horse by the name of Red Lips, who is a little wild, she dives and her eyes are open and she does it. She dives a couple more times there. She just kind of, it's blurry and her retina detaches. So she essentially becomes blind. And with the help of friends, she learns to adapt to being blind. And eventually she learns to ride the horses. And it was, they didn't think she wouldn't. It was just a matter of figuring out how. And the film doesn't. The film kind of plays it that she sneaks away and does this on her own. No. Al and her are already married by this time. It's just they figure out how to enable her to do this because this is what she's been doing. This is all she knows how to do. But one thing I think it's kind of interesting that they take out of the film, though I suppose you can't put this in a Disney film, right before she's supposed to, I think it's the day before she's supposed to do her first ride, they're sharing an apartment with the acrobats. You have the man who builds the rig, and then these two women, one of which is his sister, the other is a friend of theirs. So Sonora's waiting, she's listening to their act, she's used to it. Suddenly something starts going on, screaming, there's running, she gets up, she trips, and there's a bunch of crashing. So what happened, what they can suspect is, I think the other woman, not the sister, decides to do a headstand, and which wasn't originally part of the act, she'd been thinking about it, and it sets everything off, and the rigging collapses. She dies, I think her name was Irene, and the sister of the group ends up paralyzed. So that happens right before Sonora is supposed to go on, I think the next day, and she still does it. She still jumps after knowing that one of her close friends died, and then the other female friend is touch and go at the time. She's in the hospital. Remember, this is the probably late 1930s, I remember correctly when this happened, because she started off in 23 and her accident happens in 31. So this is the 1930s. And they'd been at the pier since 29. And yeah, so this happens about a year later. So this would have happened in about 1932. And they continue their act at Atlantic City for 11 years after she goes blind. So from 32 until later. What stops them isn't her so much is the war. So they needed men to dig the pit every year and build the enclosure and then build the ramps and stuff. And the war happens. The men are gone. They needed people to, at least someone to man the stables and the horses. And again, they're gone because the war has started. So they retire. At the end of the book, it's kind of sad. She had long since learned to read Braille. She becomes a secretary. Her husband works as a night manager of a motel. And that's kind of how they retire. Her sister, who had been part of the act, Annette, eventually marries, and I think she becomes a housewife of sorts. And they're still close. She had other siblings. Those aren't really mentioned after the rest of the book, because Annette who is I think she was 15 when she first started. She had issues. It turns out she's ambidextrous. She's a little bit more left-handed leaning. So once they allow her to switch using her left hand, she's able to be more natural at jumping the horses. So it was easier for her, and she did a lot of the act. She finished up the season after Sonora went blind, and then she continues to be part of the act as well. But eventually she gets married, and they finish, and they retire, and they miss it. I mean, her husband ran away to join the circus when he was like 11. He didn't join his dad. He ran away and joined the circus, did all a bunch of stuff, went to Europe before coming back and joining his father for the act. So they were performance people. And the war happened, and they had to stop, and they lost touch with people, and all the horses they'd been using had since passed, and the rest of them they basically put to pasture, allowed to retire. And it's an interesting book about this type of life, this specific time period. Because again, she starts in 1923. The book ends in the 40s, I believe. Let's see, they're gonna tell me when she retires. So no, yeah, her sister Annette left the show in 35. Yeah, she continued. They continued until 1942. So right around the time the war started. And it's kind of sad the way it ends. She becomes a secretary for a blind organization. I can't remember exactly. He works for a hotel. He's a night manager for a hotel after being a showman for most of his life and being in show business. But again, that world was ending. So, because after World War II, those type of events and things and traveling carnivals pretty much stopped to an extent. So, and the world changed, and they were kind of stuck. So, but it's a really, really interesting book about, again, this type of time period, the carnival scenes, where you go from carnival to carnival, what was going on in some places like Atlantic City on these boardwalks where you would have these, particularly during the summer, these different events, and how people would hire out acts like theirs where you're jumping horses. Another thing they mentioned, which is kind of funny, the ASPCA followed them around like crazy, and they couldn't do anything because the horses were taken care of very, very well. Beagle combat, it's like they're forcing them to do this. It's like the people like Sonora is like, seriously? You think we can force a horse to run up a ramp and jump off? Yeah, no. They're like, these horses love doing this. We let them go. If they didn't want to, they'd just run back down the ramp and move. And you're not gonna, when the ASPCA looked at them, it's like these horses were not being abused at all. They were very, very well taken care of. From reading the book, they loved these horses. They were their livelihood. They had she goes into detail in the beginning about the different personalities of these different horses and the way they dived and how it was different and how some of it could be more dangerous than others. Red Lips was a bit of a wild creature. This was a horse she was riding. She continued to ride him for many years because it wasn't really his fault what happened. So, but yes, you had to run him very, very specifically. But they had their own personalities, and it was very obvious from reading the book that they loved these horses, and they weren't going to abuse them. They weren't going to force them to do things. They were very specific about horses they would pick to make sure they wanted to do this, and they were capable of doing this without fear. And she talks about the different personalities and how intelligent they were. So it's very obvious that they loved them, and they thought the ASPCA was just being funny. It's like, you're irritating. You prove it over and over and over again that we're taking great care of these horses, that they're partners in what we're doing. And unfortunately, with Lightning, that was an accidental drowning, and it was something stupid. And Doc felt horrible about it. He was dying at the time himself. And it's like, he adored these animals. So he'd worked in the Wild West shows, and they respected their animals, at least he did. So it's a great book to look at when you're looking at this kind of portion of time. It's definitely, because it's a memoir. It's the record of her life and the time periods of the 20s and the 30s in the United States in show business. I would highly recommend this for any kid who, particularly if you're looking at the 1920s and 30s show business and that period of time and that lifestyle, for any kid who loves horses. This is obviously, the book is called A Girl and Five Brave Horses, so it's very, very horse centered, and just kind of an interesting peek into the life of this young woman who also overcame a major disability. I mean, she was blind. She learned Braille rather quickly, and she dove horses by using her hearing. She also talks about something interesting, that people think when people go blind, they have like somehow developed supersonic like hearing and other senses. She's like, no, you just notice them more. You learn the patterns, you learn the feeling. It's just you've lost sight, and now you have to focus on these other senses. Like, I don't suddenly hear better. It's just I'm focusing on my hearing better. I'm focusing on my touch and the smell of things better because I don't have sight anymore, and I need these to navigate her world. And she organized her life around being able to do this and became extremely independent. She was also very intelligent. She read like crazy. She talks about that after she went blind, how she missed being able to read. She would read novels. So it also dispels the idea that she was illiterate. She actually forced her sister. It's like, before you come into this show business thing, you need to finish school, finish your education, and then come join, which is kind of what she ended up doing. She did the horses. When that didn't work out, she was part of a swim team on the pier, and then she went back to doing the horses again. And then she married and grew up and left. And again, 35, the Depression's going on. So, great book. Definitely, because of that accident at the end, I'm definitely going to be leaning middle school, high school age. Again, this is nonfiction. You could probably read it to other kids, but understanding that this is somebody's life story and that some tragic things do in fact happen. Obviously, she doesn't go into detail about what the accident looked like because these were her friends. I mean, she didn't see anything. They talked about being in the hospital. These were her friends, and these were people she loved. They were sharing a home together. They'd known each other for many years at this point. So, and then she does talk about bumping heads with her sister-in-law. They didn't entirely get along. So by the end, the sister-in-law is just not really talked about all that much. Particularly after she goes blind, there's an incident where she gets in a fight with her because they spend the winters now at the sister's place, I think in Pennsylvania or something, and they get in a fight, and she's upset because she can't actually storm out. She can't leave the house. She can only go back up to her room, because she's blind. She has nowhere to go. So she talks about kind of being trapped like that, and how she was definitely bumping heads with her sister-in-law, because her sister-in-law, I think, was more into the life of the party, and Sonora was quiet and a bookworm. So, but again, it's a great book. That's the book is called A Girl and Five Brave Horses. It's, I believe, it came out in 1961. She actually died in 2003 at 99. So she died in Pleasantville, New Jersey, at the time of her death. She died when she was in 2003 in 1999. So she was alive during my lifetime, obviously very, very old. So, and the film came out probably in the 90s, I'm guessing. Where was it? Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken came out in 1991. And yes, she saw it, and yes, she thought it was kind of ridiculous. So, great book. I will review the film, which I still love, despite the fact that after reading the book, it's like, well, that's not accurate. but still, it's a good, fun film. It's a great book, particularly for history. When you're looking at this time period, it's always recommended reading. Memoirs are a good look because they show you reality. They show you what people were really doing and their lives and how they saw this time period, rather than looking at historical overviews of people who didn't live this. This was her life. This was her love of this entertainment industry of the 20s and 30s. So, horse-loving, good history book. Definitely middle grades. I would say no later than late elementary. You might be able to read it to younger kids, but I'm not sure how much they'd be interested in it. It depends on your kid. It's always depends on your kid. So parents always can judge for themselves if their kid's going to be interested in this type of topic. So that's it for this review. If you like what you see, check out the rest of the channel. I have a lot going for me. I do a lot of children's books. This is more of the historical memoirs that come up every once in a while, particularly when I focus on history. Otherwise, I do children's picture books. I do various different films. Sometimes they're book tie-ins like this one. Other times they're not. Sometimes they're just fun stuff. Sometimes they're nostalgia. It's stuff I'd like to share to people. With people, because I do have a master's degree in library science. That's one of the reasons I started this. I also do a sprinkling of homeschooling stuff. My daughter is about 3 years old, so we're going to be adding those as she gets a little bit older into more of the homeschooling stuff. We are secular homeschooling, so no religion involved here, as well as some travel stuff. So one of the reasons we chose to homeschool is because we want the freedom to travel. So I will have those videos as well. So be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you.